Flipping a coin may not be the fairest way to settle disputes. About a decade ago, statistician P. Draconian started to wonder if the outcome of a coin flip really is just a matter of chance. He had Harvard University engineers build him a mechanical coin flipper. Draconian, now at Stanford University, found that if a coin is launched exactly the same way, it lands exactly the same way. The randomness in a coin toss, it appears, is introduced by sloppy humans. Each human-generated flip has a different height and speed, and is caught at a different angle, giving different outcomes. But using high-speed cameras and equations, Draconian and colleagues have now found that even though humans are largely unpredictable coin flippers, there's still a bias built in. If a coin starts out heads, it ends up heads when caught more often than it does tails. NPR's David Turkestan reports. According to the World Health Organization, 400 million people worldwide have no access to essential health care. That is a staggering number of people. Some of those services include things like basic sanitation and clean water, prenatal care, and vaccinations or immunizations for children. Many things contribute to this crisis. Sometimes people live too remotely to get timely care if the emergency occurs. Even when living in a city, the patient-to-doctor ratio can be as high as 50,000 people to just one doctor, making it impossible for the doctor to meet the demands of healthcare in that area. These are valuable people made in the image of God who are physically suffering, many of them without a personal relationship with Christ. So we do this with a week of hands-on training consisting of a variety of topics like basic sanitation and hygiene, taking vital signs, wound care and infection prevention, basic birth assisting, and emergency skills. Those who participate in the training then have practical skills and supplies to care for others in their community in a way that glorifies God and opens the door for sharing the gospel in a new way. Brought to you Your body's composed of trillions of cells, lots of different types of cells that make up different organs and other parts of your body. Your body is also where 10 times that number of bacteria call home sweet home. But don't be afraid, these bacteria do more good than harm to you. And besides, just in case you wanted to strike up a conversation with your tenants, you and your bacteria do have a few things in common. All cells share some common characteristics that make them living things. All organisms are composed of cells, the basic fundamental unit of life. They contain DNA as a heritable genetic material, and they can reproduce. They transcribe DNA into RNA and translate RNA into proteins on chromosomes. They can also regulate transport across a cell membrane and require chemical energy for some cellular processes. Organelles are the biggest difference between bacteria and cells that make up the human body. Organelles.
Oxytocin is a neurohormone. It fine-tunes your brain's social instincts. It primes you to do things that strengthen close relationships. Oxytocin makes you crave physical contact with your friends and family. It enhances your empathy. It even makes you more willing to help and support the people you care about. Some people have even suggested we should snort oxytocin to become more compassionate and caring. But here's what most people don't understand about oxytocin. It's a stress hormone. Your pituitary gland pumps this stuff out as part of the stress response. It's as much a part of your stress response as the adrenaline that makes your heart pound. And when oxytocin is released in the stress response, it is motivating you to seek support. Your biological stress response is nudging you to tell someone how you feel instead of bottling it up. Your stress response wants to make sure you notice when someone else in your life is struggling so that you can support each other. When life is difficult, your stress response wants you to be surrounded by people who care about you.
Let me start, if I may, with a little bit of history. The idea of strategy in business owes its origins to two intellectual giants, Bruce Henderson, the founder of BCG, and Michael Porter, professor at the Harvard Business School. Henderson's central idea was what you might call the Napoleonic idea of concentrating mass against weakness, of overwhelming the enemy. What Henderson recognized was that in the business world, there are many phenomena which are characterized by what economists would call increasing returns, scale, experience. The more you do of something, disproportionately, the better you get. And therefore, he found a logic for investing in such kinds of overwhelming mass in order to achieve competitive advantage. And that was the first introduction of essentially a military concept of strategy into the business world. Porter agreed with that premise, but he qualified it. He pointed out correctly that that's all very well, but businesses actually have multiple steps to them. They have different components. And each of those components might be driven by a different kind of strategy. A company or a business might actually be advantaged in some activities, but disadvantaged in others. He formed the concept of the value chain, essentially the sequence of steps with which a, shall we say, raw material becomes a component, becomes assembled into a finished product, and then is distributed, for example. And he argued that advantage accrued to each of those components, and that the advantage of the whole was in some sense the sum or the average of that of its parts.
I coined my own definition of success, which is peace of mind attained only through self-satisfaction in knowing you made the effort to do the best of which you're capable. I believe that's true. If you make the effort to do the best of which you're capable, trying to improve the situation that exists for you, I think that's success, and I don't think others can judge that. I think it's like character and reputation. Your reputation is what you're perceived to be. Your character is what you really are, and I think the character is much more important than what you are perceived to be. You'd hope they'd both be good, but they don't necessarily be the same. Well, that was my idea of what I was going to try to get across to the youngsters. I ran across other things. I love to teach, and it was mentioned by the previous speaker that I enjoy poetry, and I dabble in it a bit and love it. And there are some things that help me, I think, be better than I would have been. I know I'm not what I ought to be and not what I should be, but I think I'm better than I would have been if I hadn't run across certain things. And one was just a little verse that said, no written word, no spoken plea can teach our youth what they should be, nor all the books on all the shelves is what the teachers are themselves. That made an impression on me in the 1930s, and I tried to use that more or less in my teaching, whether it be in sports or whether it be in the English classroom.
Hashtag transcript. The point I'm trying to make is that when you're asleep, this thing doesn't shut down. In fact, some areas of the brain are actually more active during the sleep state than during the wake state. The other thing that's really important about sleep is that it doesn't arise from a single structure within the brain, but is to some extent a network property. If we flip the brain on its back, I love this little bit of spinal cord here. This bit here is the hypothalamus, and right under there is a whole raft of interesting structures, not least the biological clock. The biological clock tells us when it's good to be up, when it's good to be asleep, and what that structure does is interact with a whole raft of other areas within the hypothalamus, the lateral hypothalamus, the ventrolateral preoptic nuclei. All of those combine, and they send projections down to the brain stem here. The brain stem then projects forward and bathes the cortex, this wonderfully wrinkly bit over here, with neurotransmitters that keep us awake and essentially provide us with our consciousness. So sleep arises from a whole raft of different interactions within the brain, and essentially, sleep is turned on and off as a result of a range of interactions in here.
One of the social issues faced by the state of Alaska is the lack of mental and emotional well-being of the Native Alaskans. It is very unfortunate that many of the Native Americans are living under poor conditions throughout the country. In the cases of Native Alaskans, even virtually entire villages are suffering from a lack of mental and emotional well-being, which includes continuing poor physical and mental health. Alcohol abuse, domestic violence, homicides, and suicides are frequent among them, which of course, lead to families falling apart. It is tragic to see that many children are abused and not educated properly. As a matter of fact, the children themselves are abusing alcohol and other chemicals, and the rate is increasing over the time. Since parents are suffering from mental illnesses and alcohol abuse, they can't take care of their children, so many children are being taken care of by others or simply neglected. Therefore, we can conclude that Alaskan Natives are losing hold of their communities, cultural identities, and most importantly, their childhoods. So, you can see how serious the issue is. Plus, rather than making a living for themselves, they are depending on public services and subsidies. They have lost control of and responsibility for their economy and governing institutions. The Western countries' women are becoming more and more reluctant to give birth to babies. However, the male status in society remains as strong as it ever has in recent years. The birth rates increased during 20th century, but it starts to decrease over these last 2 decades. In the year 2000, as an example, the birth rate remained at around 1%. There are even some negative birth rates in other countries. Birth rates dropped to its lowest point that has never been seen in the society. It also has impacts on male in the society, especially young man, and it might have some connection with unemployment rates as well. The milk is not typical of all monasteries for many reasons. Firstly, it is very grand, which most especially later foundations aren't. Secondly, it was founded in the countryside, whereas in 17th and 18th centuries, a good proportion of foundations were made in towns. Thirdly, it still owns a substantial amount of land, because fourthly it lies in the Austrian Republic, the only European country where grand old monasteries have been in continuous existence since they were founded 900, 1000, even in one case 1200 years ago.
So we've known for decades that emissions are rising in the atmosphere because we can see them swirling up around there. So the famous Keeling curve is based on what we can actually see from space. But what you can't easily see from space is how did they get there? It still boggles my mind, but even in the year 2021, in most countries and most sectors of the economy, our process for actually answering where all those emissions coming from is still to ask polluters how much they polluted. Just kind of like hope nothing is missing in that inventory, and then add up all those numbers, sometimes manually on paper. It's amazing that every single country in the world has agreed to this process. It's one of the great things that brings me hope that everyone in the world is essentially contributing to this process. But it is such a stopgap solution. If we were really serious about stopping climate change, you can only manage what you can measure, and we need to have more information. We need to have information, not like letting it take years to compile manual reports. I mean, there are countries that haven't had an emissions inventory in 20 years. What are you actually supposed to do with information that old? We need to not just be looking at what are the emissions of entire countries, because if you want to know how to reduce them, you need to know, right, do I need to go after the cars? Do I need to go after factories? What in my country is driving all these emissions?
You see, camels are one of the only animals in the world that store all their fat in one spot. And that's useful for keeping cool in a hot climate because heat can escape faster from the rest of their body, which helps them maintain a lower body temperature. Compare that to other mammals like humans who store fat all over, making it a lot harder to stay cool. Today, camels still use the fat in their humps as a food reserve, but they're not the only ones. In extreme circumstances, the Turkana tribe in Kenya, for example, will eat camel fat to survive.
They suffer a lot from periods of extreme drought, and I have seen these people, they've been very, very short of food, and this is difficult to believe, but it's true, slit open the top of a camel's hump, take out the fat for their own consumption, and then put the top of the hump back on again.
But don't worry. The camel makes a full recovery and instances are rare. But this practice has started to generate some buzz around camel fat as a new superfood. Turns out, camel fat is loaded with fatty acids, vitamins, and minerals.
I bet all of you are familiar with this view of the ocean. But the thing is, most of the ocean looks nothing like this. Below the sunlit surface waters, there's an otherworldly realm known as the twilight zone. At 200 to 1,000 meters below the surface, sunlight is barely a glimmer. Tiny particles swirl down through the darkness, while flashes of bioluminescence give us a clue that these waters teem with life. Microbes, plankton, fish, everything that lives here has amazing adaptations for the challenges of such an extreme environment. These animals help support top predators such as whales, tuna, swordfish, and sharks. There could be 10 times more fish biomass here than previously thought. In fact, maybe more than all the rest of the ocean combined. There are countless undiscovered species in deep waters, and life in the twilight zone is intertwined with Earth's climate. Yet the twilight zone is virtually unexplored. There are so many things we still don't know about it.